Some say a man's true character shows in how he treats those who can do nothing for him. In the hard country of the Arizona Territory, where mercy is rare as water, one act of kindness would change everything. Silas Gravedigger. Pike was the most feared bounty hunter west of the Mississippi, a man who brought in outlaws dead more often than alive. His reputation was carved in gunsmoke and blood, but when he found a helpless dog caught in a steel trap, crying out in pain on a lonely desert trail, something stirred in that hardened heart. What happened next would shock everyone who knew his name. Could one simple choice of compassion lead a killer to redemption and reveal the hiding place of the most dangerous gang in the territory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun had not yet cleared the eastern ridge when Silas Pike saddled his horse that morning. But he was already thinking about death, not his own. That thought had stopped troubling him years ago, but the deaths he would likely deliver before the week was out. 5 men rode with the Blackwood gang, and every one of them had earned a noose 3 times over. The bounty on their heads totaled $4,000, which was enough to keep a man comfortable through a long winter, maybe 2 if he lived sparse. Testament, his grizzled roan, stood patient in the pre-dawn chill while Silas checked the cinch one more time. The horse had been with him for 11 years now, through more scrapes than either of them cared to remember. The animal's left ear bore a notch from a bullet that had passed too close during a shootout in Yuma, and his right foreleg carried a scar from barbed wire outside Tucson. They were a matched pair, Silas often thought, both getting older, both carrying the marks of a hard life, both still capable when it mattered. Silas himself was 53 years old, though he looked older in the right light and younger in the wrong one. His face was all angles and weather-worn leather, with lines carved deep around his eyes from squinting into too many sunrises. His hair, still thick, had gone the color of iron, not quite grey, not quite black, but something in between that suggested storms and steel. He stood just over 6 feet tall, with the kind of lean, rope-muscled build that came from years in the saddle and meals that were often late and never plentiful. He wore the same clothes he had worn for the better part of a decade: dark wool trousers tucked into scuffed cavalry boots, a faded blue shirt that had once been indigo, and a leather vest that had molded itself to his frame like a second skin. His hat was a battered thing with a Montana crease, sweat-stained and dust-covered, but it kept the sun off his neck, and that was all that mattered. Around his waist hung a gun belt that had seen more use than most men's. Bibles, and in the holster rode a Colt Peacemaker, with walnut grips worn smooth by his hand. The gun was like a part of his body now. He could draw and fire in less than a second, and he had never needed a second shot. That was how he had earned his name, not because he dug graves, though he had done that too, but because every man he went after ended up needing one. 20 years of hunting men had taught him that hesitation got you killed, and mercy got you killed slower, so he had learned to be neither hesitant nor merciful, and he had survived when better men had not. In his saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth, was the journal. He had started keeping it 12 years back, after a job in New Mexico that had gone sideways and left him tracking 3 men through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in January. The cold had been so bitter that his fingers could barely hold a pencil, but he had made himself write down every detail he could remember. Names, descriptions, habits, the way each man had moved and talked and died. It had helped him make sense of things then, and he had kept it up ever since. The journal now contained the names of 68 men. Beside each name was a date, a location, and a brief description of how the encounter had ended. Most ended the same way: a bullet, a burial, a bounty collected. Some of the entries included sketches, a distinctive scar, a unique tattoo, the layout of a hideout. The pages were stained with coffee, dust, and in a few places, blood that had long since turned brown. He did not read it often, but he kept it close. It was the only record that these men had existed, and that he had been the one to end them. The Blackwood gang was going to be entries 69 through 73 if everything went according to plan. He had first heard of them 6 months ago, when their names started appearing in the territorial newspapers. They had begun small, robbing stages, rustling cattle, the usual frontier lawlessness. But they had a mean streak that set them apart. They did not just rob. They hurt people. They did not just steal horses. They crippled them. They left a trail of burned homesteads and brutalized travelers, and the law had not been able to get close to them. 3 weeks ago, Sheriff Clayton Merriweather had sent word to Dust Creek, asking if anyone knew where to find Silas Pike. Merriweather was an old acquaintance, one of the few lawmen Silas actually respected. The man was honest in a profession that did not always reward honesty, and he had a reputation for fairness that was rare in these parts. When Silas rode into Dust Creek, Merriweather had been waiting on the porch of his office, looking tired. "They hit the Carlson place last week," Merriweather had said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Burned the house, took what they wanted, beat old Tom Carlson so bad he might not walk again. His wife died from the smoke." Silas had listened without speaking, watching the sheriff's face. "They've been running wild for months now, and I can't get close. Every time I get a lead, they're gone. Every time I send a deputy, they send him back, tied to his horse, beaten half to death." Merriweather had looked up then, meeting Silas's eyes. "I need someone who doesn't wear a badge, someone they won't see coming." "How much?" Silas had asked. "The territorial government has posted 1,000 per head, 5,000 total. I'll add another 500 from the county fund if you bring them in before they kill someone else." Silas had considered this. $5,500 was more than he typically made in a year. It was enough to buy land, maybe even hang up his guns and try living a different kind of life. The thought had appealed to him in a distant sort of way, like a place he might visit someday, but never really expected to reach. "What do you know about their movements?" he had asked. Merriweather had pulled out a map and spread it across his desk. "They've been working this area here, between the Superstition Mountains and the Salt River. They've got a camp somewhere in the high country, probably near water. They hit settlements along the edges, then disappear back into the rocks." Silas had studied the map, committing the terrain to memory. It was hard country, full of canyons and dry washes, the kind of place where a man could hide for years if he knew what he was doing. It was also the kind of place where mistakes got you killed fast. "Who's leading them?" Silas had asked. "Man named Terence Blackwood. He's the brains. His brother, Marcus, is the muscle. Then there's a half-breed tracker named Santos, a kid called Riley who's maybe 19 and meaner than a snake, and an old-timer named Dutch Keller who used to ride with the James gang before they got too hot." Silas had nodded slowly. "I'll find them." "You sure?" Merriweather had looked doubtful. 5 against 1 is long odds, even for you. I've had longer." Silas had stood, preparing to leave. "I'll send word when it's done." That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, Silas had been working his way through the territories, talking to people, listening to rumors, piecing together the pattern of the gang's movements. He had learned that they preferred to strike just before dawn, that they always left one man as a lookout, that they had a taste for whiskey and a habit of arguing among themselves. He had learned that Santos was the best tracker, but that he had a bad leg from an old wound, and that the kid Riley was quick with a gun but reckless. He had also learned about the traps. The Blackwood gang had started using bear traps to slow down pursuit. They would plant them along likely trails, hidden under dust or brush, and when a posse came after them, horses would step into the traps and break their legs. It was a cruel tactic, but effective. More than one lawman had found himself stranded on foot in the desert, miles from help, because his horse had been crippled. The traps bore a distinctive brand, a stylized B burned into the steel. It was arrogant, marking their work like a signature, but it also told Silas something important. They were confident. They did not think anyone could catch them. Now, as the sun finally broke over the ridge and spilled golden light across the desert, Silas swung into the saddle and turned Testament's head toward the high country. The air was still cool, but it would be scorching by midday. He had enough water for 3 days if he was careful, enough food for 4 if he was not picky. He had ammunition for his rifle and his sidearm, a bedroll, and a tin cup that had been with him since his army days. He also had his instincts, and those had kept him alive longer than luck or skill. The trail led northeast, following a dry wash that wound between red rock formations that rose like ancient monuments. Testament picked his way carefully over the stones, his hooves clicking softly in the morning quiet. Silas let the horse choose his own pace, trusting the animal's judgment about the footing. As they rode, Silas found his thoughts drifting, which was unusual for him. Normally on a hunt, his mind was focused entirely on the job, every sound, every movement, every detail that might mean the difference between success and failure. But today, for some reason, he kept thinking about the past. He had not always been a bounty hunter. Once, a lifetime ago, he had been a soldier. He had fought in the war, though he did not like to think about those years. He had seen things that no man should see, done things that no man should have to do. And when it was over, he had found that he did not fit anywhere anymore. The world had moved on, but he had stayed frozen in that time of smoke and blood and mud. For a while, he had drifted. He had tried his hand at ranching, at mining, at guarding stages. Nothing had stuck. Then, one day, in a town whose name he could no longer remember, a marshal had asked if he wanted to make some money tracking down a man who had robbed a bank. Silas had said yes, and that had been that. He had found he was good at it, better than good. He had a talent for reading sign, for thinking like his quarry, for being patient when patience was needed, and fast when speed was called for. 20 years later, here he was, still hunting, still alone. Testament's ears flicked forward suddenly, and Silas came back to the present. The horse had sensed something. Silas's hand moved instinctively to the rifle scabbard, but he did not draw the weapon yet. He waited, watching, listening. Then he heard it, faint, carried on the wind. A sound that did not belong in this empty country. A dog, crying in pain. Silas reined Testament to a stop and sat still, trying to locate the source of the sound. It came again, a high-pitched yelp that spoke of agony and fear. His first thought was to ignore it. He was on a hunt, and he could not afford distractions, but something in that sound pulled at him, and before he quite realized what he was doing, he had turned Testament toward it. The sound grew louder as they rounded a bend in the wash. Then he saw it, and his jaw tightened. A dog, a mutt of indeterminate breeding, maybe part shepherd, part hound, part everything else, was caught in a steel bear trap. The animal's right front paw was clamped in the vicious jaws, and blood had soaked into the dust around it. The dog was on its side, panting hard, its eyes wild with pain and terror. When it saw Silas, it tried to lunge away, but the trap held it fast, and it collapsed with another agonized yelp. Silas dismounted slowly, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. The dog watched him with terrified eyes, its lips pulled back to show its teeth. It was growling now, a low warning sound that said it would bite if he came closer. Easy, Silas said quietly. His voice, when he used it, was a low rumble that had been roughened by too many nights sleeping on cold ground and too many years of not bothering to talk. Easy now. He approached carefully, giving the dog time to see that he meant no harm. The animal's growls intensified, but it was too weak to do much more than bare its teeth. Silas could see that the trap had been here for at least a day, maybe more. The dog was dehydrated, probably near the end of its strength. He knelt in the dust a few feet away and looked at the trap. The steel jaws were old, but well maintained, and they had bitten deep into the dog's paw. The bone might be broken. Even if Silas freed the animal, it might never walk properly again. The smart thing would be to put the dog out of its misery. One bullet, and it would be over. That was the practical choice, the merciful choice even. In this country, a crippled dog was as good as dead anyway. Silas drew his gun. The dog's eyes followed the movement, and its growling stopped. It just watched him, panting, waiting. Silas looked at the animal for a long moment. Then, slowly, he holstered the gun and moved closer. The dog tried to snap at him when he reached for the trap, but it was too weak. Silas ignored the teeth and got his hands on the steel jaws. They were spring-loaded, designed to require significant force to open. He braced himself and began to pull. The steel resisted. Silas set his jaw and pulled harder, feeling the muscles in his arms and shoulders strain. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a metallic groan, the jaws began to open. The dog whimpered, and Silas kept pulling until the gap was wide enough. "Move!" he said, and the dog seemed to understand. It pulled its mangled paw free, and Silas let the trap snap shut again on empty air. The dog tried to stand, but fell. Its paw was a mess of torn flesh and matted fur, and Silas knew it was in terrible pain. He looked at it for a moment, then made a decision. He stood and walked back to Testament, pulling his saddlebag open. From inside, he took a clean shirt, one of only two he owned, and tore a strip from the bottom. Then he retrieved his canteen and returned to the dog. The animal watched him warily as he knelt again. This time, it did not growl. Silas uncapped the canteen and poured a little water into his cupped hand, holding it out. The dog sniffed, then began to lap desperately at the water. Silas let it drink for a moment, then pulled his hand back. "Not too much at once," he said. "Make yourself sick." He poured water over the injured paw, washing away some of the blood and dirt. The dog whined, but did not pull away. Working carefully, Silas wrapped the strip of cloth around the wound, binding it as well as he could. It was not much, but it would keep the dirt out and might slow the bleeding. When he was finished, he sat back on his heels and studied his work. The dog lay still now, its eyes half closed, exhausted. It was a pathetic creature, thin, scarred, clearly used to a hard life, but it was alive, and it would stay alive if Silas had anything to say about it. He stood and looked around, trying to figure out what to do next. He could not just leave the dog here. Even with the bandage, it would not survive on its own, but he also could not carry it on Testament. The horse was already bearing all the weight it should. While he was thinking, his eyes fell on the trap itself, and he noticed something he had missed before. Burned into the steel, near the hinge, was a mark, a brand, a stylized B. Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. He knelt and examined the trap more closely. There was no doubt. This was one of the Blackwood gang's traps, which meant they had been through here recently. He stood and looked around with new eyes, reading the landscape the way he had been trained to do. The wash continued northeast, winding deeper into the canyon country. There were tracks here, old ones, mostly eroded by wind, but visible if you knew what to look for. Horse tracks, 5 sets, maybe 6 days old. The Blackwood gang had come this way, and they had planted this trap to discourage pursuit. Silas looked down at the dog, which had lifted its head, and was watching him. The animal's eyes were clearer now, less wild. It seemed to understand that Silas had helped it. "Can you walk?" Silas asked. The dog struggled to its feet, favoring the injured paw but managing to stand. It took a tentative step, then another. It was limping badly, but it could move. "All right then," Silas said. "Let's see where this goes." He mounted Testament and started forward, following the old tracks. Behind him, the dog began to follow, hobbling along on 3 legs and sheer determination. Silas did not look back, but he slowed Testament's pace just enough that the dog could keep up. They followed the wash for another 2 hours, and in that time, Silas found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He talked, not much, just a few words here and there, directed at the limping dog that refused to be left behind. "Testament's a good horse," he said at one point, patting the roan's neck. "Steadier than most people I've known." The dog looked up at him with what might have been understanding, or might have been simple exhaustion. It kept walking. "You're stubborn," Silas observed later. "I'll give you that." By the time the sun reached its zenith and the heat became oppressive, the dog was struggling. Silas could see it in the way the animal's head drooped, in how each step seemed to cost more than the last. He called a halt in the shade of an overhanging rock and dismounted. The dog collapsed immediately, its sides heaving. Silas poured water into his hat and set it down. The dog drank gratefully, though Silas noticed it was still being careful not to drink too fast. Smart animal. While the dog rested, Silas studied the terrain ahead. The wash opened into a wider canyon, and the tracks he had been following became clearer here. Definitely 5 horses, and they had not been trying to hide their trail. That bothered him. The Blackwood gang was supposed to be clever, cautious. Why leave such obvious sign, unless they wanted someone to follow? The thought made Silas reassess everything. He studied the canyon walls, looking for positions where a rifleman might wait. He looked for signs of other traps, places where an ambush might be staged. The more he looked, the less he liked what he saw. This was a perfect place to kill a man. He was about to turn back to find another route when the dog lifted its head and sniffed the air. Its ears came forward, alert, and it stared into the canyon with sudden intensity. Silas went still, his hand moving to his rifle. "What is it?" he asked quietly. The dog stood, wincing as weight came onto its injured paw. It took a few halting steps forward, still sniffing, and then looked back at Silas as if to say, "This way." Silas frowned. The dog was looking toward a narrow side canyon that branched off to the left. It was easy to miss if you were not looking for it, just a crack in the rock face, barely wide enough for a horse to pass through single file. The main canyon continued straight ahead, following the obvious trail. The side canyon went in a completely different direction. Silas walked over to the side canyon and examined the ground. At first he saw nothing. The rock here was hard, not the kind that held tracks easily, but then he noticed something. A few broken twigs on a creosote bush, snapped at about saddle height. And there, barely visible in the dust at the entrance, the faint impression of a horseshoe. Someone had come through here, and they had tried to hide it. Silas looked at the dog, which was still watching the side canyon with keen interest. "You smell them, don't you?" he said softly. The pieces fell into place. The obvious trail in the main canyon was a decoy, meant to lead pursuers into an ambush or simply waste their time on a false trail. The real path was this hidden side route. How in God's name had a stray dog figured that out? Silas studied the animal more carefully. Now that it was standing and alert, he could see details he had missed before. The dog was lean and rangy, built for endurance rather than speed. Its coat was a mottled brown and grey that would blend into the desert perfectly. Its ears were large and mobile, constantly moving to catch sounds. And its nose, Silas had seen tracking hounds before, and this dog had that same focused intensity when it scented something. This was not just some lost pet. This was a working dog, or had been once. Probably belonged to a rancher or a tracker. Somehow, it had ended up out here, and somehow it had picked up the scent of the men Silas was hunting. "All right," Silas said, making his decision. "We'll try it your way." He mounted Testament and turned the horse toward the side canyon. The dog followed, limping but determined. The passage was narrow, and the walls rose high on either side, blocking out much of the sun. It was cooler here, but also darker, and Silas felt exposed in a way he did not like. If someone was waiting up ahead, there would be nowhere to run. He loosened his rifle in its scabbard and kept his eyes moving, scanning the rim of the canyon above. Testament's ears were forward, alert but not alarmed. That was a good sign. The horse would sense danger before Silas would. They traveled through the passage for perhaps half a mile, and then it opened into a small box canyon. Water trickled from a crack in the rock face, forming a shallow pool before disappearing into the sand. Around the pool, the ground was churned with hoofprints, many of them, and fresh. Silas dismounted and examined the tracks carefully. 5 horses had been here recently, probably within the last day or 2. They had watered their animals and rested for a while. There were boot prints, too, and the remains of a small fire that had been kicked apart, but not completely erased. This was it, the Blackwood gang's hideout, or at least one of their camps, but they were gone now. Silas swore softly. He had been close, so close, and he had missed them by a day. He walked the perimeter of the camp, looking for any clue about which direction they had gone, but the tracks led in multiple directions, probably deliberately confusing the trail. The dog, meanwhile, had found the water and was drinking deeply. When it finished, it began sniffing around the camp, its nose to the ground. Silas watched it work, and then something occurred to him. "Can you track them?" he asked. The dog looked up at him, and Silas felt foolish for a moment. It was just a dog. It could not understand complex commands. But then the animal returned to sniffing, moving in a deliberate pattern around the camp. It paused at several spots, spending extra time near the fire pit and at the place where the horses had been tied. Then it moved to the eastern edge of the camp and stopped, looking back at Silas. "That way?" Silas asked, walking over. The dog wagged its tail, the first time Silas had seen it show any sign of happiness, and started forward, following a trail that Silas could not see, but the dog clearly could. Silas stood there for a moment, considering the situation. He was a man who relied on his own skills, his own judgment. He had survived 2 decades of hunting dangerous men by trusting himself and no one else. The idea of following a stray dog into hostile territory went against every instinct he had, but that dog had led him to this camp when he would have walked right into an ambush in the main canyon. That dog had a nose that could apparently track 5 men across rock and sand. And that dog had refused to quit even with a mangled paw and no reason to trust a human being. Sometimes, Silas reflected, you had to trust that the world was trying to tell you something. "All right, partner," he said, using a word he had not spoken in years. "Let's see where they went." He mounted Testament again, and together, a feared bounty hunter, a steady horse, and a 3-legged dog, they left the box canyon and headed east into country that Silas had never seen before. The terrain grew rougher as they traveled. The easy washes and open desert gave way to a labyrinth of stone formations, narrow passes, and dead-end canyons. It was the kind of country where a man could get lost and die of thirst within sight of help, where every turn looked the same, and the sun played tricks with distance and direction. But the dog seemed to know where it was going. It would pause occasionally, sniff the air or the ground, and then continue with confidence. Silas found himself trusting that instinct more with each mile. As the afternoon wore on and shadows began to lengthen, Silas called another halt. They were in a narrow defile between 2 rock walls, and he did not like traveling through such places after dark. Too easy to walk into trouble. He made a cold camp. No fire, nothing that might give away their position, and divided his remaining food between himself and the dog. It was not much, just some hardtack and jerky, but the dog ate gratefully. While the animal ate, Silas changed the bandage on its paw. The wound looked better than he had expected. The bleeding had stopped, and though the paw was swollen, there was no sign of infection yet. With luck and care, the dog might actually keep the leg. "You need a name," Silas said as he worked. "Can't keep calling you dog." The animal looked at him with intelligent eyes. Silas thought for a moment. "How about Scout? That's what you are, after all." The dog's tail wagged once. "Scout it is, then." As darkness fell and the desert temperature dropped, Silas wrapped himself in his bedroll and leaned against his saddle. Scout curled up beside him, close enough that Silas could feel the warmth of the animal's body. It had been a long time since Silas had shared his camp with any living thing besides testament. It felt strange, but not unpleasant. Before he closed his eyes, he pulled out his journal and made a new entry by the light of the rising moon. He did not write about the Blackwood gang, though. Instead, he wrote about the trap, about the dog, about the choice he had made. "Found something today," he wrote in his careful script. "Not sure what it means yet, but I think maybe I needed to find it." He closed the journal, tucked it away, and let sleep take him. Dawn came cold and clear, painting the rock walls in shades of pink and gold. Silas woke to find Scout already alert, sitting up and watching the eastern passage with interest. The dog's ears were forward, but there was no tension in its posture. Whatever it sensed out there, it was not immediate danger. Silas rose stiffly, feeling the ache in his joints that came from sleeping on hard ground at his age. There had been a time when he could sleep anywhere and wake ready to fight. Those days were behind him, though he was not quite ready to admit how far behind. He checked Scout's paw first thing. The swelling had gone down slightly, and when he pressed gently around the wound, the dog flinched but did not pull away. That was progress. He applied a fresh bandage, using the last clean strip of cloth from his sacrificed shirt. "We're going to need supplies soon," he told Scout. "Water especially. I've got maybe a day left, and that's rationing hard." The dog looked at him, as if it understood the concern. They set out as soon as there was enough light to travel safely. Scout took the lead again, nose to the ground, following whatever scent trail it had picked up. Silas found himself studying the animal's technique with professional interest. The dog would quarter back and forth across the trail, checking both sides, then return to the center line. When it lost the scent, it would circle until it found the trail again. It was methodical, patient work, the kind of tracking that took intelligence, not just instinct. "Someone trained you well," Silas observed. "Wish I knew who. I'd like to thank them." The trail led them through a series of winding passages that seemed to go on forever. Silas tried to keep his bearings, noting landmarks and the position of the sun, but he had to admit that without Scout, he would be hopelessly lost by now. Around mid-morning, they emerged onto a high plateau that offered a view of the country ahead. Silas reined in Testament and sat for a moment, studying the landscape. To the north, the land fell away into a series of deep canyons, their walls striped with layers of red and white stone. To the east, the plateau continued for a few miles before dropping off into what looked like a wide valley, and to the south, barely visible in the distance, Silas could see something that made his pulse quicken. Smoke, just a thin wisp, rising straight up in the still morning air. It was perhaps 5 miles away, maybe less, tucked into one of the canyons where it would be invisible from most directions, but from up here, it stood out like a signal fire. Silas dismounted and pulled his telescope from his saddlebag, an old army model that had served him well over the years. He extended it and put it to his eye, scanning the area where the smoke was rising. At first, he saw nothing but rock and shadow. Then, as his eye adjusted, he began to pick out details. There was a canyon there, narrow but deep, with high walls that would provide excellent cover. The smoke was coming from somewhere inside it, probably from a campfire that had been carelessly maintained. He could not see any people from this distance, but the smoke was enough. Someone was down there, and given where they were, and the trail that Scout had been following, it was almost certainly the Blackwood gang. Silas lowered the telescope and thought carefully about his next move. 5 men against 1 was poor odds, even for someone with his experience. He needed an advantage, surprise, position, or some way to divide them. He studied the terrain between his current position and that distant canyon, planning his approach. There was no direct route. He would have to descend from the plateau, cross open ground where he would be visible for a time, and then work his way along the canyon rim until he could find a way down. It would take hours, and it would have to be done carefully. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and they would spot him. Then he would be the one caught in a trap. Scout whined softly, and Silas looked down. The dog was watching him, its head tilted. "I know," Silas said. "It's risky, but that's what I do." He packed away the telescope and checked his weapons. The Colt was clean and loaded, 6 rounds in the cylinder. His rifle, a Winchester lever-action, held 15 rounds, and he had 2 boxes of ammunition in his saddlebag, enough for a sustained fight if it came to that. He also checked his knife, a broad-bladed weapon that he carried in a sheath on his belt. He had not had to use it in close combat for several years, but the edge was still sharp. He kept it that way out of habit. Satisfied that he was as ready as he could be, Silas mounted Testament and started down from the plateau. Scout followed, moving more easily now that the paw was properly bandaged, and the animal had had time to adjust to traveling on 3 legs. The descent took longer than Silas had hoped. The trail was steep and treacherous, forcing them to backtrack several times when they encountered dead ends or slopes too dangerous to attempt. By the time they reached the canyon floor, the sun was past its peak, and the day was beginning to cool. Silas found a sheltered spot among a jumble of boulders and decided to wait. Rushing in now, tired and exposed, would be foolish. Better to rest, let the horses recover, and approach the gang's camp after dark, when he would be harder to spot. He unsaddled Testament and rubbed the horse down, checking for any signs of injury or exhaustion. The roan was holding up well, but Silas could tell the animal was feeling the strain of the past 2 days. They both were. Scout settled down nearby, and Silas shared the last of his food with the dog. It was not much, a few pieces of hardtack that had gone soft in his saddlebag, and the final strip of jerky. He gave most of it to Scout, keeping just enough for himself to quiet his stomach. The water was a bigger concern. He had perhaps a pint left in his canteen, and Testament needed water more than he did. Silas poured half into his hat and let the horse drink, then rationed the rest carefully. "We'll need to find water tomorrow," he told Scout, one way or another. As the afternoon faded toward evening, Silas sat with his back against a boulder and watched the canyon where the Blackwood gang was camped. The smoke had stopped, which meant they had put out their fire. That was smart. It suggested they were more careful than he had given them credit for, or maybe they were preparing to move again. That thought troubled Silas. If they broke camp tonight and scattered, he might lose them entirely. Scout was good, but tracking 5 men who were actively trying to disappear would be nearly impossible, even for a dog with a nose like that. He would have to move soon. Tonight, probably. Get close enough to confirm they were there. Maybe even get a count and see what he was dealing with. The waiting was the hard part. Silas had never been a patient man by nature, though he had learned patience over the years. But sitting still while his quarry was so close went against every instinct he had. Scout seemed to sense his restlessness. The dog moved closer and rested its head on Silas's leg, a gesture of simple companionship that Silas found surprisingly comforting. He reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, something he had seen other people do with their animals, but had never done himself. Scout's tail wagged slowly. "You're good company," Silas admitted quietly. "Better than most people I've known." As darkness finally began to fall and the stars emerged overhead, Silas made his decision. He would wait until full dark, then approach the canyon on foot. Testament would stay here with the saddle and supplies. If things went wrong, the horse was smart enough to find his way back to Dust Creek eventually. And Scout? Silas looked at the dog, considering the animal was injured, would only slow him down or give away his position. But Scout had proven invaluable so far. That nose had found the hidden trail, tracked the gang across impossible terrain, and might be the only reason Silas had gotten this close. "You want to come?" Silas asked. Scout stood immediately, ready. "All right then. But you stay quiet and you stay close. Understood?" The dog wagged its tail once, a gesture that Silas chose to interpret as agreement. Together they waited. for true darkness to fall. The moon was a thin crescent, providing just enough light to navigate by, but not enough to expose them. Silas moved through the darkness with the careful, deliberate steps of a man who had done this many times before. Scout stayed close to his left side, limping but silent. They approached the canyon from the east, using the broken ground and scattered boulders for cover. Silas stopped frequently to listen, his ears attuned to any sound that did not belong. The desert at night was not silent. There were insects, the occasional call of a night bird, the rustle of small animals moving through the brush, but there were also sounds that meant danger. The clink of metal on metal, the murmur of voices, the whicker of a horse. As they drew closer to where Silas had seen the smoke, he began to smell it. The acrid scent of a dead campfire, overlaid with other odors. Unwashed men. Horses. Whiskey. He motioned for Scout to stay put, then crept forward alone until he could see down into the canyon. There they were. 5 men were camped in a natural alcove in the canyon wall, protected from above by an overhang and from the sides by steep rock faces. It was a defensible position, the kind of spot that men on the run would choose. They had a small fire burning now, just enough to provide warmth and light for cooking. The flames were shielded by rocks, so they would not be visible from a distance. But from Silas's vantage point directly above, he could see everything. He counted the men carefully. 2 were sitting near the fire, passing a bottle back and forth. 1 was tending to the horses, which were tied to a picket line at the far end of the alcove. The 4th man was standing watch at the canyon entrance, though his attention seemed more focused on the bottle than on his surroundings. The 5th man was lying on his bedroll, apparently asleep. Silas studied each one, comparing them to the descriptions Sheriff Merriweather had given him. The 2 at the fire looked like brothers. Same broad shoulders, same heavy build, same way of moving. That would be Terence and Marcus Blackwood. One of them, probably Terence, seemed to be doing most of the talking, gesturing with the bottle to emphasize his points. The man with the horses was smaller, moved with a slight limp. Santos, the tracker. He was checking their hooves, working with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of experience. The lookout was young, maybe 20, with a cocky way of standing that suggested he thought highly of himself. Riley, the kid who was supposed to be fast with a gun, and the man sleeping, or pretending to sleep, was older, grey-haired. Dutch Keller, the former James gang member, all 5 of them, together in one place. It was almost too good to be true. Silas watched them for a long time, learning their patterns, their habits, the way they interacted. Terence Blackwood was clearly in charge, making decisions and giving orders that the others followed without argument. Marcus seemed content to let his brother lead, but there was a meanness in the way he moved that suggested violence was never far from the surface. The kid, Riley, was the weak point. He was supposed to be on watch, but he kept glancing back at the fire, clearly wishing he was part of the conversation. And he was drinking, which meant his reflexes would be slower than they should be. Santos was the one Silas was most concerned about. The man was thorough, careful, professional. He would be the hardest to surprise. As Silas watched, the conversation at the fire grew heated. He could not hear the words clearly, but the tone was unmistakable. They were arguing about something. Money, probably, or the division of loot. That was usually what outlaws fought about. Terence Blackwood stood abruptly and threw the bottle against the rock wall, where it shattered. Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that carried clearly in the night air. Riley turned to watch, abandoning his post entirely. Only Santos seemed unconcerned. He finished with the horses and walked over to his own bedroll, moving with that careful limp. As he did, his eyes swept the canyon rim, a professional habit, probably automatic, and for a moment, Silas thought the man was looking directly at him. Silas froze, not even breathing. Scout behind him also went perfectly still. Santos's gaze moved on, and he settled down on his bedroll. The argument at the fire was winding down now, voices getting quieter as whatever dispute they had been having resolved itself, or simply ran out of energy. Silas waited another 30 minutes, making sure they were settling in for the night, then carefully backed away from the rim. When he was far enough that he would not be heard, he stood and made his way back to where Scout was waiting. The dog looked at him expectantly. 5 of them, Silas whispered, all in one place. But it's a good position. I can't get to them without being seen, and if I go in shooting, someone's going to get away. Scout tilted its head, listening. Silas thought through his options. He could wait until morning and try to catch them when they broke camp, but that meant fighting in daylight when they could see him coming. He could try to pick them off one at a time, but that would alert the others and turn it into a running gun battle across the canyon country. Or he could do what he had done before, many times. He could use their own patterns against them. An idea was forming. It was risky, maybe even reckless, but it had a chance of working. He made his way back to where he had left Testament, Scout following. The horse nickered softly when they approached, and Silas spent a moment calming off the animal, stroking its neck and murmuring quiet reassurances. Then he opened his saddlebag and pulled out his journal. He had a stub of pencil wrapped in the oilcloth, and by the faint moonlight, he began to sketch. He drew the layout of the canyon, marking the position of the camp, the horses, the entrance. He noted where each man had been, which way they were facing, what their blind spots were. He drew the canyon rim, marking the places where a man could descend without being seen. When he was satisfied that he had captured everything important, he studied his sketch and began to plan. The key was the horses. If he could scatter the horses, the gang would be on foot. On foot, they could not run far, and they could not carry much. They would be stuck, forced either to fight or to surrender. But getting to the horses meant getting past the lookout, past Santos, and into the heart of their camp without being detected. It meant moving through the canyon in the dark, navigating by memory and feel, and hoping that no one woke at the wrong moment. It was the kind of plan that had gotten better men than Silas killed. He closed the journal and looked at Scout. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. "Am I crazy for even considering this?" Scout's tail wagged once. "That's what I thought," Silas said with a thin smile. "Well, if we're going to be crazy, we might as well be thorough about it." He checked his weapons again, making sure everything was ready. The Colt was loaded, the rifle was loaded, the knife was sharp. He had matches in a waterproof tin and a length of rope that might come in handy. There was one more thing he needed to do. He pulled out a piece of paper, one of the blank pages from the back of his journal, and wrote a brief note in his careful script. "To Sheriff Clayton Merriweather, Dust Creek. If you find this, it means I didn't make it. The Blackwood gang is camped in a box canyon approximately 30 miles northeast of the Superstition Range. 5 men, well armed. The horse is yours if you want him. Silas Pike." He folded the note and tucked it into Testament's saddlebag where it would be easily found. Then he stood and looked at the horse for a long moment. "You've been a good partner," he said. "Best horse I ever had." Testament snorted softly, as if to say the feeling was mutual. Silas turned to Scout. "You ready for this?" The dog stood, balanced on 3 legs, and looked at him with absolute trust. "All right then," Silas said. "Let's go make some bad decisions." They left Testament with the supplies and started back toward the canyon. The night was wearing on. It must be close to midnight now, and the temperature had dropped to the point where Silas could see his breath. Good. The cold would keep the outlaws huddled close to their fire, less likely to hear small sounds in the darkness. As they approached the canyon rim, Silas stopped one more time to study the layout. The camp was quiet now. The fire had burned down to embers. He could see dark shapes that were men sleeping, and the darker shapes of horses standing at the picket line. Riley, the lookout, was sitting now instead of standing, his back against a rock. From the angle of his head, Silas thought he might actually be asleep. Perfect. Silas found the place he had marked in his mind earlier, a narrow crack in the canyon wall that looked like it might offer a way down. He approached carefully, testing each handhold before committing his weight to it. The descent was slow and nerve-wracking. Every small sound, the scrape of his boot on stone, the rustle of his coat, seemed magnified in the darkness. But the outlaws slept on, and the lookout did not stir. Scout waited at the top, watching. Silas had considered bringing the dog down, but the animal's injured paw would make the climb too dangerous. Better to let Scout stay as a lookout of his own. Silas was halfway down when his boot slipped on a loose rock. The rock tumbled down the canyon wall, clattering against stone as it fell. To Silas, hanging frozen on the rock face, it sounded like an avalanche. Below him, one of the sleeping figures stirred. Then another. Silas pressed himself flat against the wall, trying to blend into the shadows. His heart was pounding, not from fear, but from the sudden rush of adrenaline that came when a plan started to fall apart. "What was that?" a voice called out. Riley, the lookout, finally awake. "Probably just a rock falling," another voice answered. Terence Blackwood, sounding annoyed at being disturbed. "Go back to sleep." "Sounded close? Then go check it out instead of whining about it." Silas heard footsteps approaching his position. He could not see Riley in the darkness, but he could track the young man's progress by sound. The kid was coming directly toward the base of the cliff where Silas hung. There was no time to climb back up, and no way to descend without being seen. Silas was caught, exposed, with nowhere to go. Above him, at the canyon rim, Scout gave a low growl, just loud enough to carry. Riley stopped walking. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Marcus Blackwood this time, sounding irritated. "Something up on the rim. Like a coyote, maybe. Then shoot at it if it makes you feel better. Just let us sleep." Riley stood still for a moment longer. Then Silas heard him turn and walk toward a different part of the canyon, away from where Silas hung. The kid was going to investigate the sound Scout had made. Silas used the distraction to continue his descent, moving as quickly as he dared. He reached the canyon floor just as Riley fired a shot toward the rim, not aimed at anything in particular, just a warning shot to scare off whatever animal he thought he had heard. The gunshot echoed off the canyon walls, and the camp exploded into activity. Men were shouting, grabbing for weapons, trying to figure out what was happening. Silas ran. He was not running away from the camp. He was running toward it, towards the horses. In the confusion, with everyone looking toward where Riley had fired, no one was watching the picket line. He reached the horses and pulled his knife, slashing through the rope that held them. The animals, already spooked by the gunshot, needed no encouragement. They scattered, thundering past the camp and down the canyon toward freedom. "The horses!" someone yelled. Santos, probably. "Someone's after the horses." Silas was already moving again, sprinting back toward the cliff face. He had accomplished what he came for. The gang was on foot now. All he had to do was get out alive. A gun fired, and he felt the bullet pass close enough to his ear that he heard it whistle. He dove behind a boulder as more shots rang out, the muzzle flashes lighting up the canyon in strobing bursts. "There!" Riley's voice, high and excited. "By the cliff!" Silas drew his Colt and fired twice over the top of the boulder, not aiming at anything in particular, just trying to make them keep their heads down. Then he holstered the gun and started climbing. The ascent was faster than the descent had been, fueled by desperation and the knowledge that men with rifles were shooting at him. Bullets chipped stone around him, sending fragments of rock stinging against his hands and face. One shot came so close it tore through his coat sleeve, but he kept climbing. He was almost to the top when a bullet struck the rock directly beside his left hand. The impact sent a jolt through his arm, and for a moment his grip loosened. He started to slip, scrabbling for purchase, his boots sliding on the smooth stone. Then teeth closed around his wrist, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to hold. Scout had grabbed him and was pulling backward, adding just enough counterweight that Silas could regain his footing. "Good boy," Silas gasped, finding a new handhold. "Good boy." He hauled himself over the rim just as another volley of shots rang out. Scout released his wrist and backed away, giving Silas room to roll clear of the edge. Below he could hear the outlaws shouting at each other, their voices angry and confused. He took the horses. How many are there? I only saw one man. One man couldn't have done this. Well, one man just did. Silas lay on his back for a moment, catching his breath and taking stock. His left hand was bleeding from where a rock fragment had cut it, and his right shoulder ached from the climb, but otherwise he was intact. The plan had not gone the way he had intended, but it had worked. The Blackwood gang was on foot, angry, and stuck in that canyon. Now he just had to figure out what to do next. He crawled to the edge and looked down carefully. The outlaws had built up their fire and were using the light to search the canyon floor. Santos was examining the tracks near the picket line, his limp more pronounced as he moved. The others were arguing, pointing in different directions, clearly unable to agree on a plan. "We need to catch those horses," Terence Blackwood was saying. "Without them, we're sitting ducks. Whoever did this might still be out there," Santos said quietly. "Could be waiting to pick us off one by one." "He's right," Dutch Keller added. The old outlaw had been quiet until now, but his voice carried authority. This was planned. Someone knew where we were, knew how to get to us. That means bounty hunter, probably. "Pike!" Marcus Blackwood spat the name like a curse. "Had to be. Nobody else would be crazy enough to try something like this." Silas smiled grimly. At least his reputation was still intact. "If it's Pike, we need to leave," Dutch said. "Now, before he brings the law down on us." "Leave how?" Riley's voice was shrill with panic. "We don't have horses." "Then we walk," Terence said. "Grab what you can carry and leave the rest. We move fast. We can be out of this canyon before dawn." Santos shook his head. "Moving at night, on foot, through this terrain, that's how people die. We should wait for daylight." "Daylight is when Pike comes back with a posse," Marcus argued. "We need to move now." They continued arguing, and Silas continued watching. This was useful information. They were scared, disorganized, turning on each other. That made them vulnerable. But Dutch Keller was right about one thing. Moving through this country on foot at night was dangerous. If they tried it, some of them might not survive the journey, and not because of Silas. The desert was just as lethal as any bounty hunter. Silas considered his options. He could let them go, track them at first light, and pick them off one by one as they struggled through the canyons. That was the safe approach, the smart approach. Or he could end this now. He had ammunition, he had the high ground, and they were clustered together around their fire. A dozen well-placed shots could finish it before they had time to scatter. It would be easy, clean, exactly the kind of thing that Silas, grave digger Pike, would do. His hand moved to his rifle, and he began to pull it from the scabbard. Below, the outlaws were still arguing, completely unaware that death was looking down at them. Silas settled the rifle against his shoulder and sighted down at the group. His finger found the trigger. All he had to do was squeeze. He thought about Sheriff Merriweather, about old Tom Carlson and his wife who had died in the fire. He thought about all the other people the Blackwood gang had hurt, all the lives they had ruined. These men deserved what was coming to them. His finger tightened on the trigger, and then Scout whined softly beside him, and Silas paused. He looked at the dog, who was watching him with those intelligent eyes. Scout was not judging him. Dogs did not judge, but something in that gaze made Silas think. He had freed Scout from a trap instead of putting a bullet in the animal's head. That simple act of mercy had led to everything that followed, finding the hidden trail, tracking the gang, even surviving the climb just now, when Scout had grabbed his wrist and pulled him to safety. What would have happened if he had made the other choice? If he had taken the easy path and ended the dog's suffering quickly, he would never have known about the hidden canyon. He would have walked into the ambush in the main trail. He would probably be dead right now, or at best, still wandering the desert looking for a gang that had vanished into the stone. One act of mercy had changed everything. Silas lowered the rifle and let out a slow breath. He was not a good man. He knew that about himself. He had killed too many people, done too many hard things to pretend otherwise. But maybe, just this once, he could try being better than he was. "All right," he said quietly to Scout. "We do this the hard way." He stood and called down into the canyon, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Blackwood, this is Silas Pike. Your horses are scattered from here to the Superstition Range. You're on foot, you're surrounded, and the law will be here by tomorrow. You've got one chance to walk away from this alive. Put down your weapons and surrender." The reaction was immediate. Guns fired upward, bullets whining off the rocks around him. Silas dropped flat and waited for the volley to end. "That answer your question?" Marcus Blackwood shouted up at him. "Just wanted to offer," Silas called back. "We can do it the hard way if you prefer." He pulled back from the edge before they could fire again. The standoff settled into an uneasy stalemate. The outlaws could not leave the canyon without exposing themselves to fire from above, and Silas could not get down to them without being shot. So they waited, each side watching the other, as the night slowly gave way to the grey light of pre-dawn. Silas used the time to think. He had boxed the gang in, but he had also boxed himself into a position where finishing the job was going to be difficult. He could wait for them to run out of water and supplies, but that could take days. And he was not much better off than they were. His own water was gone, and Testament was a mile away with the rest of his gear. More importantly, the longer this dragged on, the more likely it was that one of them would find a way out. Santos especially. The man was a tracker, which meant he knew how to read terrain and find paths that were not obvious. If he managed to scale the canyon wall somewhere out of Silas's sight, the whole thing could turn around fast. Scout had curled up beside him, exhausted from the night's activities. The dog's injured paw was bleeding again, and Silas made a mental note to change the bandage as soon as there was enough light to work by. The animal had more than earned its keep tonight. As the sky gradually lightened, Silas could see the canyon below more clearly. The outlaws had extinguished their fire and taken cover behind rocks and whatever else they could find. Smart. It meant they understood the danger they were in. "Pike!" Terence Blackwood's voice echoed up from below. "We need to talk." Silas did not answer immediately. His experience, when outlaws wanted to talk, it usually meant they were planning something. He waited, watching for movement. "I know you can hear me," Terence continued. "I've got a proposition for you." "I'm listening," Silas called back, keeping his position concealed. "You're one man. You can't watch all of us, all the time. Sooner or later, you're going to have to sleep, or take a drink of water, or look the wrong way. When that happens, one of us is going to get past you, maybe more than one." "That's not a proposition," Silas observed. "That's just you telling me things I already know. My proposition is this. Let us go, and we'll give you half of what we've got. That's near about $2,000 in gold and silver, more money than you'd make bringing us in." Silas almost laughed. "I'd get more than that in bounties. Plus, I wouldn't have to worry about you shooting me in the back the moment I turned around." "Then what do you want?" Frustration was creeping into Terence's voice. "You can't seriously think you can take all 5 of us. I've taken longer odds," Silas said. It was not quite true, but they did not need to know that. There was a long silence from below. Silas used it to study the canyon walls more carefully, looking for any route the outlaws might use to escape. The eastern wall had a few promising cracks, but they would be difficult to climb and would leave a man exposed. The western wall was sheer and offered nothing. The canyon entrance was narrow, easy to watch. As long as Silas stayed alert, he could keep them bottled up. The question was, for how long? The sun cleared the horizon, and warm light began to flood into the canyon. Silas could see the outlaws clearly now, could count them, and verify that all 5 were still there. They looked tired, scared, and angry, a dangerous combination. Scout stirred and lifted its head, ears suddenly alert. The dog was looking toward the north, away from the canyon. "What is it?" Silas asked quietly. Scout whined and stood, balancing on 3 legs. The hackles on its neck were raised. Silas turned to look in the direction Scout was watching, and his blood went cold. Dust, a plume of it, rising in the distance. Someone was coming, riding hard. Silas grabbed his telescope and put it to his eye. It took a moment to find the source of the dust, but when he did, his jaw tightened. 6 riders, spread out in a line, moving fast across the desert floor. They were still a few miles away, but they were coming directly toward this canyon. More of the Blackwood gang. That did not make sense. Everyone said there were only 5 men, unless they had reinforcements that nobody knew about, or unless someone else entirely had picked up the trail. Silas lowered the telescope and thought fast. If those riders were friendly, if it was Sheriff Merriweather with a posse, somehow tracking him out here, then his problems were solved. But if they were hostile, he was about to be caught between 2 fires. Below him, the outlaws had noticed the dust, too. He could hear them talking, their voices excited. "That's Cortez," Riley was saying. "Has to be. I told you he'd come." Cortez. The name meant nothing to Silas, but the outlaws clearly knew who it was, and they seemed to think whoever it was would be on their side. This changed everything. Silas pulled back from the canyon rim and whistled softly. Scout limped over to him, and Silas quickly checked the dog's paw. The bleeding had stopped again, but the wound needed proper attention soon. He wrapped a fresh bandage, the last strip of clean cloth he had, and secured it as well as he could. "We need to move," he told the dog. "Can't stay here if those riders are coming to help them." Scout wagged its tail once. "Ready." Silas gathered his rifle and the few other things he had with him, then started back toward where he had left Testament. He moved quickly but carefully, keeping low, using the terrain for cover. Behind him, he could hear the outlaws shouting to each other, their spirits lifted by the approaching riders. He reached Testament and found the horse right where he had left him, calmly grazing on the sparse desert grass. Silas saddled up quickly and mounted, then sat for a moment, trying to decide on a plan. 6 men plus 5 made 11. 11 against 1 were odds that even Silas Pike could not overcome. If he stayed and fought, he would die. Simple as that. But if he ran, the Blackwood gang would go free. All the people they had hurt, all the lives they had destroyed, it would all be for nothing. Silas looked at Scout, who was watching him with those steady, trusting eyes. "This is the part where a smart man would ride away," Silas said. "Live to fight another day. Cut his losses." Scout tilted its head. "Problem is," Silas continued, "I've never been particularly smart." He turned Testament toward the canyon and urged the horse forward. They stopped at a position where Silas could see both the canyon and the approaching riders. He dismounted, pulled his rifle, and found a good spot among the rocks. The riders were close now, maybe half a mile out. Silas could see them clearly without the telescope. 6 men, well armed, riding with the kind of confidence that came from numbers. In the canyon below, the Blackwood gang had come out of cover. They were standing in the open now, waving their arms, clearly trying to signal the approaching riders. Silas sighted down his rifle, placed the front bead on a rock about 20 feet in front of the lead rider, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester cracked, and a geyser of dust and rock fragments erupted where the bullet struck. The riders pulled up sharply, their horses dancing and wheeling. Silas worked the lever and fired again, this time at a different angle, bracketing the riders. The message was clear. They were in rifle range, and whoever was shooting knew what they were doing. The wood-ash riders scattered, taking cover behind rocks and rises in the ground. One of them fired back, but the shot was wild, nowhere close to Silas's position. "That's far enough," Silas called out, his voice carrying across the desert. "Next one won't be a warning shot." There was a brief silence. Then a new voice called back, accented, maybe Mexican or Spanish. "We do not want trouble, friend. We are just passing through." "That's so," Silas shouted back. "Then pass through somewhere else. This canyon is closed for business." Another silence. The riders were talking among themselves, probably trying to decide if one man with a rifle was worth fighting over. In the canyon, Terence Blackwood was yelling at the riders, trying to coordinate something. Silas could not hear the exact words, but the intent was clear. They wanted the riders to attack him from one direction, while the gang attacked from another. Silas fired again, this time putting a bullet into the ground right at Terence's feet. The outlaw dove for cover, and the others scattered. "Everyone stay where you are," Silas called. "Nobody moves. Nobody gets shot." It was a bluff, and a desperate one. He could not actually keep 11 men pinned down indefinitely. But if he could delay them, make them cautious, maybe he could buy enough time to think of something better. Scout barked suddenly, a sharp, urgent sound. Silas turned and saw what the dog had spotted. One of the riders had dismounted and was working his way around to the south, using the broken ground to stay hidden. In another minute or two, he would be in position to flank Silas. Silas shifted his position, keeping the rifle trained on the approaching man. "I can see you," he called. "Stop right there, or the next bullet has your name on it." The man froze, then slowly backed away. But now another rider was moving, this time from the north. They were testing him, probing for weaknesses, and they had found one. He could not watch every direction at once. This was not going to work. Silas needed help, or he needed a miracle, and he was fresh out of both. Then Silas heard something that changed everything, the sound of more horses coming from the west. At first, he thought it was more reinforcements for the outlaws, which would have been the final nail in his coffin. But Scout's reaction was different this time. The dog's tail was wagging, and it was looking toward the approaching sound with interest rather than alarm. Silas risked a glance and felt his chest tighten with something that might have been hope. A line of riders was emerging from a ravine about a quarter-mile away. 8 of them, moving in formation, and even from this distance, Silas could see the glint of metal badges on their chests. Sheriff Merriweather. He had brought a posse. The outlaws saw them too. In the canyon, the Blackwood gang suddenly realized they were about to be caught between 2 forces, and their earlier confidence evaporated. The 6 riders who had come to help them were also seeing the posse, and their enthusiasm for a fight was rapidly disappearing. "Blackwood!" Merriweather's voice carried across the desert, amplified by a speaking trumpet. "This is Sheriff Clayton Merriweather of Dust Creek. You and your men are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and come out with your hands up." In the canyon, there was a hurried conference among the outlaws. Silas could see them arguing, gesturing wildly. Terence seemed to be in favor of fighting, but the others were less certain. Dutch Keller was shaking his head, and even Marcus looked worried. The 6 riders who had come to assist the gang were already backing away, clearly wanting no part of a fight against lawmen with badges and legal authority. One by one, they turned their horses and began riding back the way they had come. "Cortez, you coward!" Riley screamed after them. "You said you'd help us!" But the riders kept going, quickly disappearing into the maze of canyons and washes. Silas watched them go, then turned his attention back to the canyon. The Blackwood gang was alone now, outnumbered and outgunned. With no way out, Merriweather brought his posse to a halt about 100 yards from Silas's position and dismounted. The sheriff was a tall man in his late 40s, with a weathered face and steady eyes. He walked over to where Silas was positioned, moving carefully to avoid presenting a target to anyone in the canyon below. "Pike," he said by way of greeting, "I see you've been busy." "Sheriff," Silas acknowledged. "This is a surprise. How'd you find me?" "Your horse," Merriweather said. "Or rather, 5 horses that came wandering into Dust Creek yesterday morning, wild-eyed and lathered. All of them had the Blackwood brand. I figured if their horses had come from this direction, you must have done something to separate them from their owners. So I gathered some men and followed the trail." "Those weren't their horses," Silas said. "Those were horses they stole." "Well, the trail still led here." Merriweather studied the canyon below. "How many are down there?" "All 5. Terence and Marcus Blackwood, Santos, Dutch Keller, and the kid Riley." You boxed them in pretty good. There was a note of approval in Merryweather's voice. They can't get out without us seeing them. They were getting help until you showed up, Silas said. 6 riders coming from the east. The outlaws called one of them Cortez. Merryweather's expression darkened. Miguel Cortez. He runs guns across the border. If he was coming to help the Blackwoods, that means they've been dealing with him. That's worse than I thought. He ran when he saw your badges. He would. Cortez is smart enough to avoid lawmen when the odds aren't in his favor. Merryweather turned back to the canyon and raised his speaking trumpet. Blackwood, you've got 1 minute to decide. Either you surrender or we come in shooting. What's it going to be? There was a long pause. Then Terence Blackwood's voice came up from the canyon, bitter and defeated. We want guarantees. We surrender. You don't hang us. You'll get a fair trial, Merryweather called back. That's all I can promise. But if you fight, you'll die right here. That I can guarantee. More discussion below. Silas could see the outlaws huddled together, their body language speaking of desperation and fear. Finally, Dutch Keller stood up, his hands raised. I'm done, the old outlaw said clearly. I've seen enough killing for one lifetime. I'm surrendering. He walked slowly toward the canyon entrance, his hands still raised. Merryweather signaled 2 of his deputies to cover him, and they moved in to take Dutch into custody. One by one, the others followed. Santos came next, limping badly. Then Riley, looking young and scared now that the reality of his situation had set in. Marcus Blackwood was 4th, scowling but accepting defeat. Terence Blackwood was the last. He stood in the canyon for a long moment, his hand near his gun, and Silas thought for a second that the man was going to try something stupid. But then Terence's shoulders sagged, and he too walked out with his hands up. Merryweather's deputies moved in quickly, disarming the outlaws and binding their hands. The whole thing was over in less than 5 minutes, ending not with gunfire and bloodshed, but with quiet acceptance of capture. Silas stood and walked down to join Merryweather. Scout followed, and several of the deputies noticed the dog. That your dog, Pike? One of them asked. Found him in a trap, Silas said. He's the one who led me to them. Merryweather looked at Scout with interest. A tracking dog? Better than most I've seen, Silas admitted. As the deputies secured the prisoners and prepared them for the journey back to Dust Creek, Merryweather pulled Silas aside. I need to tell you something, the sheriff said quietly, about why I'm really here. Silas waited. When those horses came into town, I recognized one of them. It belonged to a rancher named William Hayes. He reported it stolen 3 weeks ago. Same day his daughter disappeared. Something cold settled in Silas's stomach. Disappeared how? He found signs of a struggle at their line shack up in the hills. Blood, torn clothing, but no body. He thought maybe she'd been taken by the gang. Merryweather's voice was tight. She's 17 years old, Pike. Her name is Sarah. Silas looked over at the prisoners. They were sitting in a line now, guarded by deputies, looking sullen and defeated. None of them looked like the kind of men who would take a young girl. But then, evil rarely announced itself clearly. You think they know where she is? Silas asked. I think they know what happened to her, Merryweather said. But getting them to talk is going to be another matter. Silas walked over to where the outlaws sat. He studied each face in turn, reading them the way he had learned to read men over 20 years of hunting. Terence and Marcus were angry and defiant. Riley was scared. Santos was carefully neutral, revealing nothing. But Dutch Keller would not meet Silas's eyes. The old outlaw was staring at the ground, his jaw tight, and when Silas stopped in front of him, Dutch's shoulders tensed. You know something, Silas said quietly. Dutch did not answer. A girl named Sarah Hayes, 17 years old. Where is she? Still no answer, but Dutch's hands were trembling now, and Silas knew he had found the right man. Silas knelt down so he was at eye level with Dutch. I'm going to give you one chance to do the right thing, he said, his voice low and hard. You tell me where that girl is, and I'll speak for you at your trial. I'll tell the judge you cooperated. Maybe that saves your neck. Maybe it doesn't, but at least you'll be able to say you did one decent thing at the end. Dutch's eyes flickered up briefly, then down again. "She's alive," he said, so quietly that only Silas could hear. "Or she was when we left." "Where?" "There's another camp, 2 days north of here. We kept her there with our supplies. Terence's idea. Figured she'd be worth ransom if things went bad." Silas felt rage building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "Who's guarding her?" "Nobody. We tied her up, left her with food and water. We were supposed to go back after this job." "How long ago?" Dutch swallowed hard. 5 days. 5 days. In this desert, in this heat, even with food and water. Silas did not let himself finish that thought. "You'll need to give me exact directions," he said. Dutch nodded slowly. "I'll draw you a map. But Pike, you should know Terence. He was planning to kill her once we got the ransom. He just hadn't told the rest of us yet. I heard him talking to Marcus about it." Silas stood and walked back to Merriweather. "We've got a problem," he said, and quickly explained what Dutch had told him. Merriweather's face went pale. 2 days north? That's hard country. And if she's been alone for 5 days— "I'll go," Silas interrupted. "I'll go now. You take the prisoners back to Dust Creek. I should send some of my men with you. I'll move faster alone." Silas was already heading toward Testament. "Have Dutch draw that map. I'll leave as soon as I have it." 10 minutes later, Silas was riding north with a crude map folded in his pocket, Scout limping alongside Testament. Behind him, Merriweather and his posse were heading back to Dust Creek with 5 prisoners in tow. The sun was climbing toward midday, and the heat was already brutal. Silas pushed Testament harder than he should have, driven by the knowledge that somewhere ahead, a 17-year-old girl was alone and possibly dying. He had come out here to collect a bounty. He had done his job, caught his men. He should be riding back to Dust Creek to claim his money. Instead, he was riding deeper into the Qaeda wilderness, chasing after someone he had never met, someone who might already be beyond help. Scout looked up at him as they rode, and Silas thought about that moment 2 days ago when he had found the dog in the trap. He could have made the easy choice then, the practical choice, the choice that would have saved time and trouble, but he had chosen differently, and that choice had led to everything else: finding the hidden trail, tracking the gang, even being in the right place at the right moment to box them in until Merriweather arrived. Maybe this was the same kind of choice. Maybe the right thing to do was not always the practical thing. Or maybe, Silas thought, he was just tired of being the man who always chose the easy way. "Come on, Testament," he said, urging the horse forward. "Let's go find this girl." The map Dutch had drawn was crude, but surprisingly detailed. It showed a series of landmarks, a split rock formation, a dry waterfall, a stand of saguaro cactus growing in an unusual cluster that would lead to the outlaws' supply camp. According to the map, the camp was hidden in a small canyon with a natural spring, one of the few reliable water sources in this part of the territory. Silas studied the map as he rode, committing the landmarks to memory. The terrain matched what Dutch had described, which was something, but a 2-day journey when the map was 5 days old meant that even if they made good time, Sarah Hayes would have been alone for a week. That was a long time for anyone, let alone a 17-year-old girl who had been kidnapped and tied up. He tried not to think about what condition she might be in. Instead, he focused on riding, on watching for the landmarks, on keeping Testament moving at a pace the horse could sustain. Scout was struggling. The dog's injured paw was clearly causing pain, and the pace Silas was setting was hard on an animal that was essentially traveling on 3 legs. But Scout never fell behind, never complained, just kept moving with the same stubborn determination it had shown from the beginning. Around midday, Silas called a brief halt in the shade of an overhanging cliff. He had found a small seep in the rock face. Not enough to be called a spring, just a place where water had collected in a natural depression. It was brackish and warm, but it was wet, and that was all that mattered. He let Testament drink first, then Scout, and finally filled his canteen and took a long drink himself. The water tasted of minerals and stone, but it would keep them going. While the animals rested, Silas checked Scout's paw again. The wound was inflamed and clearly infected, despite his efforts to keep it clean. The dog needed proper medical attention, the kind that involved a veterinarian and a clean clinic, not makeshift bandages in the middle of the desert. "We need to finish this soon," Silas told Scout, "for both our sakes." Scout's tail wagged weakly. They traveled through the afternoon, following Dutch's map from landmark to landmark. The split rock was where it was supposed to be. The dry waterfall was exactly as described, a cliff face with vertical striations that looked like water had once poured over it, though it had probably been dry for centuries. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Silas spotted the cluster of saguaro cactus. There were 7 of them, grown so close together that they looked like a single enormous organism. It was an unusual sight. Saguaros typically grew apart from each other, competing for the scarce water, and it marked the location clearly. According to the map, the canyon was just beyond the cactus cluster, hidden behind a ridge of broken rock. Silas approached carefully, not wanting to skyline himself against the sunset. He dismounted and led Testament on foot, with Scout following close behind. The ridge was steeper than it had appeared from a distance, and by the time he reached the top, he was breathing hard. He paused there, staying low, and looked down into the canyon beyond. It was small, maybe 100 yards across, with walls that rose 30 feet on 3 sides. At the far end, he could see the dark smudge of vegetation that suggested water, and in the center of the canyon, partially hidden by brush and carefully positioned to be invisible from above, was a camp. Silas pulled out his telescope and studied the camp carefully. There was a tent, actually more of a lean-to, constructed from canvas and rope. Near it were several wooden crates, probably containing the supplies Dutch had mentioned, a fire ring, though no fire was currently burning, and tied to a stake near the tent, Silas's breath caught. A figure, small, unmoving, lying on the ground. He adjusted the telescope, trying to see more clearly in the fading light. The figure was definitely a person, and from the size and build, almost certainly female. She was wearing what looked like a torn dress, and her hands appeared to be bound behind her back. But was she alive? Silas could not tell from this distance. She was not moving, and he could not see any sign of breathing. For all he knew, he had ridden 2 days through the desert to find a corpse. He lowered the telescope and considered his options. The smart thing would be to wait for full darkness, then approach under cover of night. But if Sarah Hayes was still alive, every minute mattered. She might be unconscious or dying from dehydration or... No, he could not afford to wait. Silas returned to Testament and pulled his rifle from its scabbard. He checked the loads in both the Winchester and his Colt, making sure everything was ready. Then he took a long drink from his canteen, knowing it might be a while before he had another chance. "Stay here," he told Scout. "Guard the horse." The dog looked at him with what might have been reproach, but settled down beside Testament. Silas started down into the canyon, moving slowly and carefully, using every bit of cover the terrain offered. He kept his rifle ready, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement or danger. The canyon was quiet except for the sound of wind moving through the rocks. As he got closer to the camp, he could hear water trickling. The spring, probably feeding a small pool or stream. That was good. If Sarah had managed to get free, even partially, she might have been able to reach water. He was 50 yards from the camp when the figure moved. It was just a slight shift, barely perceptible, but Silas saw it. An arm moving, or maybe a leg. She was alive. Relief and renewed urgency flooded through him in equal measure. He picked up his pace, no longer quite so concerned about stealth. If she was alive, she needed help now. He reached the camp and approached the figure carefully. Up close, he could see that it was indeed a young woman, a girl, really, though he hated to think of anyone so young in this situation. She was lying on her side, her hands bound behind her back with rough rope, her ankles similarly tied. Her dress was torn and filthy, her hair matted, her face burned by the sun. Her eyes were closed, but she was breathing, shallow, rapid breaths that spoke of fever or extreme exhaustion. Silas holstered his rifle and knelt beside her. "Sarah," he said quietly. "Sarah Hayes?" Her eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, glazed with fever. She looked at him without recognition, without any apparent awareness of where she was or who he might be. Silas pulled his knife and cut the ropes binding her hands and feet. The rope had been tied tight enough to leave deep marks in her skin, and her wrists were raw and bloody where she had struggled against her bonds. "It's all right," he said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "You're safe now. I'm going to get you out of here." She made a sound, a weak, rasping noise that might have been an attempt to speak. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Silas retrieved his canteen and supported her head, tipping a small amount of water into her mouth. She coughed, tried to drink too fast, and he pulled the canteen away. "Slow," he said. "Small sips. You'll make yourself sick otherwise." He let her drink a little more, then capped the canteen. She was in bad shape, severely dehydrated, probably feverish from infection or exposure, and possibly suffering from other injuries he could not see in the failing light. He needed to get her to water, to shelter, to help. But moving her now, in her condition, was risky. If he put her on a horse and rode hard for Dust Creek, the journey itself might kill her. Silas looked around the camp, assessing his options. The spring was nearby. He could hear it clearly now. That meant fresh water, which was essential. The tent was intact and could provide shelter. And the supply crates might contain food, blankets, or other useful items. He made his decision. They would stay here tonight, stabilize her condition as much as possible, and then start back in the morning when she was stronger. Moving carefully, Silas lifted Sarah in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, he noted with concern, and carried her to the tent. Inside, he found a bedroll that the outlaws had left behind. It was dirty but dry, and it was better than the bare ground. He laid her on the bedroll and then went to explore the supply crates. Inside, he found exactly what he had hoped for: food, medical supplies, whiskey, and several blankets. The outlaws had been planning to hole up here for a while, and they had stocked accordingly. Silas took a bottle of whiskey and some clean cloth back to the tent. Sarah's eyes were closed again, her breathing still too fast and shallow. He soaked a piece of cloth in whiskey and began cleaning the wounds on her wrists and ankles. She gasped and tried to pull away when the alcohol touched the raw flesh, but she was too weak to resist. Silas worked quickly but gently, cleaning each wound and then wrapping it with clean bandages from the medical kit. When he was finished, he covered her with blankets and went to find the spring. It was a small pool fed by a crack in the rock face, the water clear and cold. Silas filled his canteen, then filled a tin cup and brought it back to Sarah. He lifted her head and helped her drink, a little at a time, until the cup was empty. Then he refilled it and gave her more. By the time full darkness had fallen, Sarah's breathing had slowed and deepened. She was sleeping now, a real sleep, rather than the semi-conscious state she had been in when he found her. That was progress. Silas built a small fire outside the tent, just enough to provide warmth and light. Then he went back to the ridge and brought Testament and Scout down into the canyon. The horse needed water and rest, and Scout deserved a chance to lie down by a warm fire. As the dog settled by the flames, Silas examined its paw again. The infection was worse. Scout needed rest, needed care, needed more than Silas could provide out here. "Tomorrow," Silas told the dog, "tomorrow we head back, and we get you to a real doctor." Scout's tail thumped once against the ground. Silas made a pot of coffee, using supplies from the crates, and sat by the fire, sipping the hot, bitter brew and thinking about the chain of events that had brought him here. If he had killed Scout when he found the dog in that trap, none of this would have happened. He would never have found the hidden trail, never tracked the gang, never learned about Sarah Hayes, she would have died here, alone and forgotten. And no one would have known what happened to her. One choice, one moment of mercy, and it had changed everything. Silas pulled out his journal and opened it to a blank page. By the flickering firelight, he wrote, Day 5. Found the Hayes girl. She's alive, barely. Condition is poor, but stable. Will attempt return to Dust Creek tomorrow. Scout's paw is infected. Should have put him down days ago. Glad I didn't. Starting to think maybe there's more to life than just surviving. Maybe mercy matters as much as justice. Maybe more. Strange to be learning that at 53, but better late than never. He closed the journal and looked at Scout, who was watching him with those intelligent, trusting eyes. You taught me that, Silas said quietly. A half-dead dog in a trap. Taught me what 20 years of hunting men couldn't. He sat there through the night, keeping watch, tending the fire, checking on Sarah every hour to make sure she was still breathing. Scout slept beside him, occasionally whimpering in dreams that might have been about running free across open ground on 4 good legs. And somewhere in the hours between midnight and dawn, Silas Pike, the most feared bounty hunter west of the Mississippi, a man known for killing without hesitation or remorse, found himself thinking about a different kind of life, a life where mercy came before justice, where saving was more important than taking, where the right choice was not always the easy one. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Silas stood and stretched his stiff muscles. Sarah was sleeping peacefully now, her breathing steady. Scout was awake, looking up at him with anticipation. All right, Silas said. Let's go home. The journey back to Dust Creek took 3 days instead of 2. Sarah was too weak to ride on her own, so Silas fashioned a makeshift travois using poles and canvas from the supply camp, and Testament pulled her while Silas walked alongside to steady the load. It was slow going, and every bump and jolt made Silas wince, knowing it must be causing her pain, but there was no better option. She could not sit a horse, and he could not carry her the entire distance. Scout traveled with them, limping badly now. The infection in the dog's paw had spread, despite Silas's efforts, and the animal was clearly in pain, but Scout refused to be left behind, refused to quit, just kept moving with that same stubborn determination. On the first day, Sarah barely spoke. She was conscious for periods of time, but she seemed to be somewhere far away, not quite present. Silas gave her water regularly, small amounts of food when she could keep it down, and spoke to her in a calm, steady voice, even when she did not respond. Your father is waiting for you in Dust Creek, he told her as they traveled. William Hayes. He's been looking for you since the day you disappeared. He never gave up hope. At the mention of her father's name, Sarah's eyes focused briefly. Papa, her voice was barely a whisper. That's right. We're taking you home to him. A tear slid down her cheek, and then she closed her eyes again. By the second day, she was stronger. She could sit up on the travois, could speak in full sentences, though her voice was still hoarse from dehydration and disuse. Who are you? She asked as they stopped to rest in the shade of a rock formation. Name's Silas Pike. I'm a bounty hunter. I was tracking the men who took you. Are they? She hesitated. Are they dead? No, they're in custody, heading to Dust Creek for trial. All 5 of them. Sarah looked at him with something like wonder. You caught all 5? Had help, Silas said. Sheriff and his posse. And Scout here found their trail. He gestured to the dog, who was lying in the shade with its injured paw stretched out. Sarah noticed the bandage on Scout's paw for the first time. What happened to him? Bear trap. Same gang that took you. They planted it to stop pursuit. Silas checked the bandage, frowning at the heat and swelling he could feel even through the cloth. He's been tracking them ever since. Poor thing, Sarah said softly. She reached out carefully, and Scout sniffed her hand, then allowed her to pet his head. You're a brave dog, aren't you? Scout's tail wagged weakly. They traveled on, And as the day wore on, Sarah began to talk more. She told Silas about the day she was taken, how she had been checking the line shack on her father's ranch when the Blackwood gang had appeared, how they had grabbed her, tied her up, threatened her father with harm if she did not cooperate. "They kept me in that canyon for weeks," she said, her voice hollow. "They said they were going to ask my father for ransom money, but I heard them talking one night. The leader, Terence, he was planning to kill me even if Papa paid. Dutch told me," Silas said. "That's how I knew where to find you." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Dutch was the old one, with grey hair," Silas nodded. "He was the only one who was kind to me," Sarah said. "The others, they were cruel, or they ignored me, but Dutch made sure I had enough water. He would talk to me sometimes, tell me I would be all right." She looked at Silas. "Will they hang him?" "Probably," Silas said honestly. "He rode with the gang, helped them rob and steal. The law doesn't make many exceptions for being kind to a hostage. That doesn't seem fair." "No," Silas agreed. "It doesn't, but fair and legal aren't always the same thing." On the third day, they saw Dust Creek in the distance. It was mid-afternoon, and the town looked like a mirage shimmering in the heat, but it was real. And Silas felt something in his chest relax at the sight. "We're almost there," he told Sarah. "Your father will be waiting." Sarah sat up straighter on the travois, straining to see the town. "I can't believe it's real," she whispered. "I thought I was going to die in that canyon." "You're stronger than you think," Silas said. "You survived a week alone in the desert. Not many people could do that." As they approached the outskirts of town, people began to notice them. Word spread quickly, and by the time they reached the main street, a crowd had gathered. Silas saw Sheriff Merriweather pushing through the people, and beside him, a man, in his 50s with desperate hope written across his face. "Sarah!" William Hayes broke into a run, reaching the travois before Silas could even bring testament to a full stop. "Sarah! Oh God, Sarah!" "Papa!" Sarah reached for him, and Hayes gathered his daughter into his arms, both of them crying. Silas stepped back, giving them space. Around him, the crowd was murmuring, some people crying, others smiling. It was a happy ending, the kind that did not happen often enough in this hard country. Merriweather walked over and stood beside Silas. "You did good work, Pike. Real good work." Silas watched father and daughter embrace. "She did the hard part. I just brought her home." Still, Merriweather looked at Scout, who had collapsed in the street, too exhausted to stand. "Your dog doesn't look good." "No," Silas said quietly. "He doesn't." The town doctor, a capable woman named Margaret Reeves, who had trained in Philadelphia before moving west, saw to Sarah first. She examined the girl thoroughly, treated her wounds, and declared that with rest and proper care, she would make a full recovery. "She's lucky you found her when you did," Dr. Reeves told Silas. "Another day or two and it might have been a different story." While Sarah was being cared for, Silas stood in the street with Scout, unsure what to do next. The dog was barely conscious now, its breathing labored. The infection had clearly reached the point where something had to be done. Dr. Reeves emerged from her clinic and noticed Scout for the first time. She knelt beside the dog and examined the injured paw with professional efficiency. "How long has it been like this?" she asked. "Found him in a trap 6 days ago. Been treating it as best I could, but..." Silas shrugged helplessly. Dr. Reeves unwrapped the bandage and made a sound in the back of her throat. "The infection is severe. The tissue is necrotic. I'm going to have to amputate the paw if there's any chance of saving him." Silas felt something twist in his chest. "Will he survive the surgery?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "He's weak from travel and infection, but if we don't operate, he'll certainly die within the next day or two. The infection will spread to the bloodstream." "Then do it," Silas said, "whatever it costs." Dr. Reeves looked up at him with new respect. "Bring him inside. I'll need to prepare." They carried Scout into the clinic's back room, where Dr. Reeves maintained a small surgical area. She asked Silas to wait outside, but he shook his head. "I stay," he said firmly. "He's been with me this whole time. I'm not leaving him now." Dr. Reeves did not argue. She prepared her instruments, gave Scout a dose of chloroform to put him under, and then began the surgery. Silas watched it all. The careful cuts, the removal of infected tissue, the amputation of the damaged paw, and finally the stitching. His hands were clenched into fists the entire time, and when it was over, and Dr. Reeves declared the surgery a success, he found that he had been holding his breath. "He'll need several weeks to heal," Dr. Reeves said, cleaning her instruments. "And he'll never be the same. A dog with 3 legs can live a good life, but he won't be able to work like he did before." "That's all right," Silas said, reaching down to carefully stroke Scout's head. "He's earned his rest." Scout was still unconscious from the chloroform, but his breathing was steadier now, more even. Silas sat with him, while Dr. Reeves went to check on Sarah, and as he sat there in the quiet clinic, he thought about what came next. He had the bounty money coming. $5,500 once the paperwork was complete. That was more money than he had ever had at one time. Enough to buy land, build a house, maybe raise some horses or cattle, enough to stop hunting men and start living a different kind of life. The question was whether he wanted to. For 20 years, being a bounty hunter had defined him. It was who Silas Pike was, the grave digger, the man who never missed, the hunter who always got his prey. Without that identity, what was left? He looked at Scout, sleeping peacefully now that the pain of the infected paw was gone. The dog had lost a leg but gained something else, a chance to live, to recover, to be something other than a wounded animal waiting to die. Maybe Silas could do the same. Sheriff Merriweather came into the clinic an hour later and found Silas still sitting with Scout. "Doc says the dog will live," Merriweather said. "She's good at her work," Silas acknowledged. Merriweather pulled up a chair and sat down. "William Hayes wants to thank you personally. So does half the town. You're a hero, Pike." "I'm not a hero," Silas said. "I'm just a man who did his job." "You went beyond your job when you rode 2 days into the desert to find that girl. You could have taken your bounty and walked away. Nobody would have blamed you." Merriweather paused. "What made you go after her?" Silas thought about that. "I found Scout in a trap," he said slowly. "I could have left him there or put him out of his misery, but I didn't. I helped him instead. And that choice led to everything else. Finding the gang, learning about Sarah, being able to save her. So you're saying the dog led you to make better choices?" "I'm saying sometimes mercy matters more than efficiency. Sometimes saving a life is more important than taking one." Silas looked at Merriweather. "I spent 20 years learning how to kill men. Maybe it's time I learned how to do something else." Merriweather smiled. "You know, Dust Creek could use a deputy. Someone with experience tracking criminals. Someone who knows this territory. The pay isn't as good as bounty hunting, but it's steady work." "A deputy?" Silas considered this. "I'd have to wear a badge." "You would. Take orders from you. That's how it works." Silas looked down at Scout again. The dog's chest was rising and falling peacefully, and there was no sign of pain in the animal's relaxed posture. "Let me think about it," Silas said. But even as he said it, he knew what his answer would be. The old Silas Pike, the grave digger, would have taken his bounty money and ridden on to the next hunt, but he was not that man anymore. Something had changed in the past 6 days, something fundamental and irreversible. He had learned that mercy mattered, that saving was as important as taking, that the choice to help, even when it was difficult or inconvenient, could change everything. Scout stirred and opened his eyes, looking up at Silas with that same trusting gaze. The dog's tail wagged once, weakly, against the table. "Yeah," Silas said softly, scratching behind Scout's ears. "I think we'll stick around for a while." 6 weeks later, Silas Pike stood on the porch of a small house on the outskirts of Dust Creek and watched the sun rise over the desert. Beside him, Scout lay in a patch of morning sunlight, the dog's tail thumping contentedly against the wooden planks. The house was modest, just 3 rooms and a small barn out back for testament. But it was his. He had bought it with part of the bounty money, using the rest to outfit himself with the things a deputy sheriff needed. A new badge gleamed on his vest, still shiny and unfamiliar, but he was getting used to the weight of it. Scout had healed well from the surgery. The dog moved differently now, with a distinctive three-legged gait, but he got around just fine, better than fine, actually. He seemed happier without the constant pain of that infected paw, and he had adapted to his new situation with remarkable resilience. They made an odd pair, Silas thought. A bounty hunter turned deputy, and a three-legged dog, but they worked. The door opened behind him, and Sheriff Merriweather stepped out onto the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Morning," Merriweather said, handing 1 cup to Silas. "Thought you might want this before we head out. Appreciate it." Silas took a sip. "Where are we going?" "Got word that someone's been rustling cattle from the Morrison Ranch. Figured we'd ride out there and take a look." Silas nodded. It was not bounty hunting. There would be no dramatic confrontations, no life-or-death gunfights. Just patient investigation, careful tracking, and hopefully a peaceful resolution. It was different work than what he was used to, but he was learning to appreciate the difference. As they prepared to leave, a rider approached from town. It was William Hayes, with Sarah riding beside him. The girl had recovered fully from her ordeal and had even put on some weight. She looked healthy and happy. Nothing like the half-dead girl Silas had found in that desert canyon. "Mr. Pike," Sarah called out, waving. "I'm glad I caught you." Silas walked over to meet them. Scout followed, his tail wagging at the sight of Sarah. "Miss Hayes," Silas greeted her. "You're looking well." "I feel well," she said, dismounting. "Thanks to you." She knelt and scratched Scout behind the ears. "And thanks to this brave dog." Scout's tail wagged harder. William Hayes dismounted as well and shook Silas's hand firmly. "I wanted to thank you again," he said, "for bringing my daughter home. I know I've said it before, but it bears repeating." "No thanks necessary," Silas said. "I was just doing my job." "You did more than your job," Hayes insisted. "You risked your life to save her. That's something I'll never forget." Sarah stood and pulled something from her saddlebag, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I made something for Scout," she said, unwrapping it to reveal a leather collar. "It's got his name on it." "Well, Scout? That is his name, right?" "That's his name," Silas confirmed. Sarah knelt again and fitted the collar around Scout's neck. It was well made, with "Scout" tooled into the leather in neat letters. The dog sat patiently while she fastened it, then licked her hand. "There," Sarah said, standing. "Now everyone will know what a good dog you are." After the Hayes family left, Silas and Merriweather mounted their horses and headed toward the Morrison Ranch. Scout trotted alongside, keeping pace easily despite having only 3 legs. As they rode, Merriweather glanced over at Silas. "You've settled in well," he observed. "Townfolk like you. They feel safer knowing you're wearing a badge. Still getting used to it," Silas admitted. "Being on the right side of the law is different than I expected." "Different how?" "Harder, in some ways. When you're a bounty hunter, you just have to catch them. As a lawman, you have to think about justice, about giving people a fair chance, about mercy." Merriweather smiled. "You've been thinking a lot about mercy lately." "I have," Silas said. He looked down at Scout, who was sniffing the trail ahead. "Used to think mercy was weakness. Thought the only thing that mattered was getting the job done, no matter the cost. But I was wrong." "What changed your mind?" Silas told him about finding Scout in the trap, about the choice he had made in that moment. "I could have killed him," he said. "Would have been the practical thing to do, but I didn't. And that one choice led to everything else. Finding the hidden trail, tracking the gang, learning about Sarah. All of it came from one moment of choosing mercy over efficiency. You think you would have failed if you had made the other choice?" "I know I would have," Silas said. "Without Scout, I would have walked into that ambush. Without Scout's nose, I would never have found their camp. And without learning about Sarah from Dutch, she would have died alone in that canyon." He shook his head. "Mercy saved her life. More than that. It saved mine, too." They rode in silence for a while, the morning sun warm on their backs. Scout ranged ahead, clearly enjoying the work of tracking, even if he would never chase down outlaws again. "I've been keeping my journal," Silas said after a time, "writing down what happens each day. Not just the criminals I track, but other things too. Good things." "Like what?" "Like yesterday, when old Mrs. Patterson's cat got stuck in a tree and I got it down for her. Or last week, when I helped the Johnsons repair their fence. Small things, things that don't involve guns or violence or death." Silas paused. "Things that make people's lives better instead of worse." "Sounds like you're becoming a different kind of man," Merriweather said. "Maybe," Silas agreed. "Or maybe I'm becoming the man I should have been all along." As they crested a rise and the Morrison Ranch came into view, Scout barked once, a clear, happy sound, and looked back at Silas as if to say, "This way." Silas smiled. "All right, partner," he said. "Lead on." And together, a man learning to value mercy, a three-legged dog who had taught him how, and a steady horse who had carried them both through the worst of it, they rode toward whatever came next. The sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. The wind carried the scent of sage and creosote across the open land. It was a good morning to be alive. It was a good morning to be doing work that mattered, work that helped rather than hurt. And as Silas Pike rode toward the ranch with his badge gleaming in the sunlight, he thought about the journal entry he would write tonight. Not about death or violence or the men he had killed, but about healing and choice and the power of one simple act of mercy. Some say a man's true character shows in how he treats those who can do nothing for him. Silas had learned that lesson in a hard way, in a harsh place, from a half-dead dog in a steel trap. But he had learned it, and that, he thought, made all the difference. Behind them, the town of Dust Creek went about its morning business. Merchants opening their shops, children walking to school, neighbors greeting each other on the street. It was an ordinary day in an ordinary town, but for Silas Pike, it was the first day of a different kind of life, a life where mercy mattered as much as justice, where saving was as important as taking, where the choice to help, even at cost to himself, defined who he was. Scout looked back at him again, tail wagging, and Silas reached down to scratch the dog's ears. "Yeah," he said softly. "We did good, didn't we?" Scout's tail wagged harder, and together they rode on into the morning light.